Hello and welcome to this most recent episode of the Econ Coco Report. Today we have David Zweig. David Zweig, welcome, David.
Thanks for having me.
And we're really excited. David is a writer, lecturer. He's a musician. He's based in New York. He's written a number of novels. He's writing a few books right now, even. And he's a freelance journalist as well. He writes for some places that you've heard of, like The Atlantic, The New York Times, The Wall Street Journal, New York Magazine, as well as Wired. So um, very accomplished, and we're very, very happy to have him. Um, he's on to talk about some of the stuff that's caught his interest recently, and that concerns COVID. And he's written some really, really in-depth articles that look at COVID from perspectives that perhaps aren't necessarily being found in the mainstream media. And so David's here to talk about all of that. David, tell me, when did you start getting interested in COVID?
Well, as far as professionally, this happened in the spring of 2020. And I think the moment for me was, like many people, not everyone, but like many people, the pandemic hits. I live right outside New York City. My wife works in Manhattan. So we were kind of at the, American epicenter in the beginning of the pandemic here. And, they shut everything down. I was pretty nervous. I didn't know what was going on. And then you both, I'm sure, recall that the phrase was, you had to flatten the curve. So I'm like, okay, everyone just stay home for 2 weeks to flatten the curve. And then what was interesting was I saw in New York in April, the cases started dropping, like just like a stone. It's just, you just saw this 45-degree angle. I'm like, okay, great. I guess the kids will be going back to school. That's what and I talked with a friend of mine, and this scene is like in the early part of my book. I'm going to have this scene near the beginning because this is kind of where I began. And I was going for a walk with a friend of mine. I was like, hey, so I guess the kids are going back. And he was like, they're not going back. I'm like, what do you mean? We flattened the curve. The cases are dropping. And he's like, they're not going back. And like at that moment, I was kind of like, something's wrong, because we were told that. And I've just always been someone who I'm always asking. I like to ask a lot of questions. I'm curious about everything. So I very rarely just take something as a given. If I go to the doctor as a patient, or if I'm with one of my kids, I ask a lot of questions. If someone's about to give an injection to me or my kid, I'll look at the syringe and make sure it's not cloudy. I'll look at the expiration date. Some people get annoyed by that, others respect it, but that's how I am. And I would do the same thing if I'm meeting with an attorney or I'm meeting with the contract. Like, I want to know what's going on. It's very hard for me to just accept what someone, just as a given. So I didn't accept what was happening. I didn't understand why we weren't doing what we were told was going to happen. And in a very, very short amount of time, it was easy to just find this data that was available, these studies that were very early on. We knew from China. There was something out of Iceland in the very beginning that said kids are really at virtually zero risk from this thing. What's the deal? So in May, at least according to some people, I was the first person to write an article in a mainstream publication in America to say, hey, the kids should be back in school. And here's a whole bunch of data that explains why. Not the least of which is the fact that many, many countries in Europe started sending their kids back. So that was kind of what launched me on this project. And I haven't looked back since. It's this notion of two things, I guess. One, questioning what we're told. It doesn't mean that I'm cynical and assume something's wrong. It just means I want to see the underlying evidence behind whatever you're telling me, number one. And then number two, I'm always looking outside the US, in particular at Europe, just because so many of those countries are similar to our country, in many regards. So those are sort of the best analog to look at. And I'm always looking there and seeing, why are they doing things so differently from here? Um, so those are the two questions that kind of drive me every day for the past year and a half. And that's what's kind of led me on this journey
Just
and to meeting you, Anish.
Dave, that's great. Just a quick question. The friend who said they're never going back to school,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, was he, I mean, was that a wish? I mean, or was he anticipating that that would be the public health reaction? Or was it something that he was fearful and he was anticipating that they wouldn't do it for the right, from his perspective, for the right reasons?
Yeah, I think that's a very good question. I think it was more matter of fact. Like, this is a guy who's worked in politics for a while. He knows a lot of kind of influential people, and he just has a pretty good read on sort of like what's going on in society and how the policymakers and such behave, and just sort of what's going on. And he was just speaking matter of factly, and he was just like, Dave, they're not going back. And it's amazing how naive I was. It's strange because I'm not a naive person, but I don't know why. I just, when they're like, it's 2 weeks to flatten the curve, I'm like, okay, that sounds reasonable. We don't want the hospitals to be overwhelmed. I don't know why, A, I believed that, or B, why no one seemed troubled when that advice was completely disregarded, when a few weeks later it was very clear that the cases were dropping. I don't understand. I still don't exactly understand the dynamic, but he knew, and he was just like, dude, they're not going back. And I'm just like, but why? He's like, that's not how this works. They're not going back. So that was kind of the thing that started me off.
Very interesting. And where did you publish that piece, that first piece of yours?
That was in Wired.
Wired, okay.
In Wired. And it was funny, a guy named Zach Bissonette, who is pretty active on Twitter, and he's been really smart and really involved in a lot of COVID stuff related to children in particular. And he had a funny thread on Twitter that he wrote about this. And he was like, no offense, Dave. He's like, but David Zweig writing in Wired, warning about what was happening with kids in schools in the first couple days of May of 2020 is like the equivalent of someone saying that the WMDs thing was a bunch of bullshit in like Popular Mechanics or something when the New York Times and no one else was writing about it. He's like, that's kind of the equivalent of what happened here during the pandemic. So I took that as a badge of honor. I didn't take any offense. So that's kind of and Wired has been fantastic for me. That at least the couple editors I've worked with there were some of the only editors who were sympathetic to the idea of like, hey, here's a journalist who's presenting evidence that like, I can't really refute what he's saying. I know this is pushing against what everyone else is saying, but I don't see anything that's wrong with what he's saying. And I got to say, I haven't had to, there hasn't been any retractions in not one single article I've written on the pandemic. And my articles are loaded with statistics, with citing studies. It doesn't mean I don't have mistakes. There probably are mistakes in there, and I will make mistakes. But what I can say is there's nothing in there where there's been some sort of like egregious thing that's required a retraction of the article or some sort of like massive correction. So I do take pride in that. And I think that's an important thing. If you're going to be pushing back against the mainstream narrative, I think unfortunately, there's so much more pressure to get it right. If you're saying the same thing as everyone else, you can kind of BS your way through it. And yeah, some people may call you out on it, but you can kind of get away with it. But boy, if you are saying something against the CDC or against, these kind of big name public health people, you better be on your game and know that and make sure that what you're writing is accurate.
Right. That's exactly right. I mean, that's actually amazing and a credit to your talent. Give us what the sort of the main highlights, for the next 18 months of the big stories.
I had a follow-up question there, though, David.
Okay.
Why is it, David? You're based in New York, right? And from the Mecca, which is the New York Times, America's paper, we have been hearing a very, very different narrative. Why? What do you think? I mean, it's not just the New York Times. I bring it up because you're in New York, and
Right.
but the Washington Post, CNN, a number of different outlets that kind of they've made their mark on deep investigative journalism, right? Getting behind the story, getting and doing what you kind of did in that Wired piece in May of 2020, calling for, you know, schools to be open again. What did something happen that COVID like broke the brains of like everyone, or has this been a problem all along? Like what is happening here that you seem to be one of the few mainstream journalists, or not one of the few established journalists with a good record and stuff that are kind of saying this.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, that's a complex question. And I think, and I try to answer it, or I'm trying as I'm slowly making my way writing this book, to try to, tease that apart. And I think there's a lot of answers to that. But, you know, I, one thing I would say is, the New York Times or all these places, it's made up of people who are making choices and decisions. It's not, and it's an institution, but there are people inside that institution choosing to publish certain things or not publish certain things, or how they're going to frame those articles. And so the people doing the science reporting, and we can pick on the New York Times because, let's be honest, that's sort of they have their hand on the rudder, so to speak, to a large degree. It's not 100%, but what they write, most of the TV news people and stuff like that, they're going to follow the Times generally. I don't know if you can think of a circumstance where like NBC or CNN or all these other places are pushing back against the New York Times. That's pretty on. The Times to some degree sets the agenda. Maybe to a lesser degree, the Washington Post or some other places. And then the others, then there's just this kind of like big push,
Yeah,
this
yeah,
machine. So you have a couple people at one institution or a few institutions that are highly influential, and those people are making choices. And then everyone else, they're almost not even making choices. They're just following what they perceive to be the appropriate narrative. And maybe it's a part of my personality, iconoclast or something. But like I said, like I'm always asking questions. I'm not. I feel like I've never been part of a group, so to speak. Maybe that's why I'm a freelancer. Like I am comfortable with doing something different from what from what other people are doing. It doesn't mean I'm not trying to be a contrarian. Like that's
right.
not my. Someone was accusing me, it's like an epithet, calling me a contrarian. And I was like, am I a contrarian? I guess if my opinions are contrary, or not opinions, but even like my reporting, just the data that I'm seeking to uncover, for readership, I guess if that's contrary to what most people are reporting on, then so be it. But my mission isn't to try to do something different. It's to simply follow the data and follow the evidence. And it just so happens that has led me into a space that is largely contrary to what most of these people are reporting. Does that make sense?
Dave, yeah. But one thing that Anish failed to mention when he introduced you, I think you started your career as a fact checker, didn't you? I mean, I saw some pieces that you wrote. You wrote even an ode to the fact checker.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's kind of relevant here to what you're saying.
I think so. I spent 6 or 7 years or so working as a magazine fact checker at Condé Nast, and that it's a little bit of a chicken or egg thing, because that's just my personality. I try to be at least just super meticulous. I love poking holes in things and finding the error. It's just like, it's both, it's my curse, but also something that I enjoy, to just constantly find the thing that's wrong. So fact checking is sort of in my nature, but then doing it professionally for so many years kind of baked in to me, how I approach journalism now as a writer. So I think that's like deeply informed how I think about things. And one of the things is I always try to get the source information rather than a secondary source. And one of the articles I've written during the pandemic was on, there was this nurse, I think it was South Dakota, North Dakota, one of the Dakotas, where she had made these claims about patients and stuff. And I was like, that seems a little strange. And I called the hospital where she works. I spoke to other people. No one else had the experience she had. Doesn't mean she's not telling the truth, but it does call into question at least the ability to generalize what she was saying. At best, this is someone's personal anecdote. But what she said was reported on CNN and a zillion other places. All these prominent public health people were tweeting it. And that's because no one went to the source. No one called the hospital except me. No one, spoke to her. Well, they interviewed her, but she was one person. So to me, it's always about trying to get to the source information. I'm not, if I can help it, you can't always do this, but I'm not just going to repeat something and just regurgitate what I see written about in another place.
Right.
I want to actually I don't want to read the New York Times article about a study. I want to read the study itself and then find out if that reporter's framing of the study actually seems appropriate. I don't want to just report what the CDC has recommended. I want to actually look at what evidence is supposedly undergirding the CDC's recommendation.
But David, is that what normally happens? Because everyone has limits, right? I mean, COVID actually, as evidence goes, is actually not tremendously complicated. Meaning, there are places where reading the actual primary data really requires a lot of content expertise, right? And so the vast majority of journalists, I mean, and I'm sure even you now, right? Even you now, when you read a COVID study yourself, correct?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you're clearly a smart guy. I don't know. What was your undergraduate degree in? Were you a science major or something?
Political science.
Political science. Okay, so not even. But anyway, so regardless, you're a smart guy. You can obviously read through some of the studies and come to some conclusions by yourself, and you come up with things. But even you, then at that point, probably take what you've read, what interpretations you've come up in your head, and say, okay, let me take it to some people who I respect and say, okay, what do you think about this, and this, correct? And so, that's been happening since God knows how long for all of this stuff, right? If there's a climate change study that comes out, right? Like, do I expect the New York Times science journalist to necessarily be able to understand the limitations of, I mean, heck, me and Michelle would have no clue reading a climate change study and trying to come up with what the things are, let alone, a science journalist who may have majored in poli-sci or something like that. So, what you're describing is not necessarily new, right? I mean, what's happening rather is that you have a group of folks, and you've pointed out very nicely that it's actually a very small group of folks that are setting the agenda for the entire nation, that basically when something comes out, they go to certain sources, right? I think what used to happen, or maybe the thing that you're doing, which they're not doing though, their sources are all saying kind of the same thing, and they're giving these reporters at the New York Times, or nice, good people that want to get to the truth, they're giving them the idea that consensus exists when actually it does not. When Purva Mandavali reports on some study, and then in her study she's saying, this is what this person, or Dr. Walensky, is saying, or Dr. Ashish Shah is saying, whoever is saying, this is their interpretation, and then she presents that as somewhat fact. You aren't doing that. You are saying, okay, you see what Dr. Shah is saying, you see what Dr. Walensky is saying, but then you are then saying, okay, what is the other side to it? So the real question then becomes, David, why are you the only one? Is that not basic journalism to be like, okay, this is what one side is presented, right? And let me go find out what the other side is saying. But it seems like when it comes to public health and COVID, that a bunch of these small elite group of folks that are basically setting the agenda for everyone are only going to one narrow range of views. Why is that happening?
Yeah, that's a big question. I mean, I, I, I don't want to say people are lazy. I think there's a variety of things at play. And I think one of the things is, in journalism, science journalism in general, I think a lot of it tends to be, sort of like journalism by press release, whether it's a public health agency or whether it's some, nature journal, whatever it is, puts out a press release. We have a thing coming out. And I think most news outlets tend to just report what they're saying. So I'll give you an example. Last spring, the CDC put out summer camp guidance, and the guidance called for kids to be wearing masks at all times, including outdoors. And I read that and I was like, what? That seems crazy. Because we knew by then, we had known for a long time that outdoor transmission was extraordinarily rare and unlikely. And then to add on top of that, we know that kids are, less likely to be, to be symptomatic and stuff like that. So, I mean, the notion of the necessity of children wearing masks outdoors just didn't make sense on its face. I was like flabbergasted when I saw that. So I'm looking at that, and a few days later, or maybe it was like immediately after, whatever it was, after the guidance comes out, I see there's this article in the Times, and maybe there was, one or two or a few others elsewhere, where it was like, CDC summer camp guidance comes out. We talked to some experts to find out how to keep your kids safe. And there was no questioning of like, does this actually make sense? It was just the CDC sent out a press release. The journalist was like, how do you view the role of journalism? Is it to simply report with your megaphone to citizens what someone is saying? I'm a journalist. I'm now going to broadcast what the CDC has now announced. Or do you see your role as the CDC has announced something? Now, me as a journalist, I'm going to now see if what they announced makes sense. So I reached out to a bunch of people, contacts of mine and others. Some I had already been in touch with, others I hadn't, including Dimitri Christakis, who's the editor-in-chief of JAMA Pediatrics. And, I said, what do you think of this? Does this make sense to you? And he was like, no, this is insane. And I believe the word he used was, this is draconian and this is ridiculous. And I spoke to, there was a pediatric immunologist at Columbia and a few others. I had an anonymous source within NIAID, Fauci's agency. I had an anonymous source inside the CDC, and they all were saying, this is completely nuts. So I was frantic, and I'm talking to my editor, we've got to hurry. We got to get this piece out. Like, tons of people are going to be writing about this. This is insane. They're telling kids to be wearing masks outdoors. We got to get it out. And he's like, we'll get to it. And editors, they're always busy doing other stuff. So I was, working on other articles. I was getting angrier and angrier. And every day that went by, I kept feeling more and more panicked that someone was going to beat me to it, or many people were going to beat me to it. 10 days went by. I think it was 10 days went by from when the guidance came out to when my article came out. No one wrote a thing with data, interviewing people, questioning whether this made sense. So my article comes out. So for me as a journalist professionally, that was great. I was the one who blew that shit open. But for society, not so good. And then, so that's like an example, to me, is one of the most resonant ones, just because it was such like a surreal experience seeing these articles. No one questioned it. They just were simply broadcasting what the CDC said. And I seemed to be the one person who then questioned it, interviewed a bunch of experts just to make sure, because as you noted, I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not an infectious disease person. So the one thing I always do, and this is just a side note, I've been criticized a couple of times. There was this super obnoxious congressperson when I testified before Congress who was like, do you have a medical degree? Do you have this? Do you have that? And I said to her, I am a journalist. all of the things I write are based on the evidence and from talking with experts. So I don't claim to have the medical degree. However, I should say, as you both know, there are plenty of most physicians have no clue about what's going on with COVID. It doesn't mean they're not brilliant. It doesn't mean they're not amazing urologists and whatever else, but they're not reading these studies. You don't have to be a genius to read a study. You don't. You have to be reasonably bright and have a good reading skills, but any reasonably intelligent person who takes the time can understand a study with basic evidence. And look, you might need some help explaining, with something like statistical things with, confidence intervals or whatever. But so anyway, this is I apologize. I'm being a little.
No, that's great, Dave. But so, I mean, the question is, if this, what you've witnessed, this broadcast function of media, essentially to broadcast the official party line,
right.
Is this something that is unique to COVID and the pandemic, or does COVID and the pandemic reveal something that maybe have always been the case, except that a pandemic, as Anish was saying, we can all have, I mean, in a way, there's no huge expertise about whether it's ridiculous or not to mask kids, on the playgrounds or not. Whereas to try to figure out if Iraq has, WMDs, or if, banks should be bailed out during, in 2008 and that sort of thing, that requires more content expertise. And now perhaps, so I mean, has your view of the media sort of changed in a way, even historically, when you look back and you wonder, has it always been the case, or is it something new just because of the panic of the moment?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think the media has always done this. My impression of it and understanding of our public health agencies has changed, sadly. I can't believe how naive I was. I mean, I was, it's not like I always assumed everything they said was, spot on, but the degree of just distortion and clear confirmation bias, and misrepresentation of a whole variety of data is stunning. It's been astonishing to experience and witness. So I think journalism has always performed this sort of broadcast function, by and large, and there's always going to be X amount of journalists who are investigating and asking questions, and the bulk of them not doing so. But you sort of had a second point in your question, which is very salient, which is a lot of this doesn't require an expertise in epidemiology or infectious diseases or virology, because the questions that we are grappling with are ones that are more philosophical and ethical, and about questions about how we want to live our lives and how society should function. Those are completely outside the expertise of Dr. Fauci. Those are outside of Rochelle Walensky's expertise. That is not their area to dictate what degree of risk tolerance should be appropriate for individuals or for society. Nevertheless, that's the role that's been thrust upon them. And that is the role that so many kind of, self-styled public health experts, all these people who you see on Twitter, many of whom, might be just an emergency room doctor or someone else who have no particular expertise. And this doesn't mean they're not, welcome to share their opinion, but this sort of credentialism idea, that this notion of who are you to talk about this? Right. One of the brightest people on this is a guy, Wes Pegden, who's a mathematician, but he has brilliant analysis and, to my mind, really wise opinions on how a lot of things should function, as does Dr. Coca here, a lot of times your perspective, who I've been following. So I think this idea that we need to listen to epidemiologists all the time, but that has nothing to do with the questions of what we're really grappling with as a society. So I think that's one of the, and I'm going to be writing about that in my book. I'm fascinated by that.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Sort of relinquished this decision making to these people where it's outside of their purview.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's an ambiguity in public health where it portrays itself as essentially a scientific endeavor, when in fact it is a political endeavor. Right? I mean, public health is by nature political,
Right.
but it hides the politics hide behind a veil of neutrality, of sort of scientific objectivity, and that needs to be, ripped. I mean, the veil needs to be. I mean, and I think hopefully it's happening, and that's what COVID has revealed.
There's no such thing as neutral objective reporting. Every human being has their own lens through which they experience the world. You can aim for objectivity, but the notion that someone called me like an advocate journalist or something, and I'm like, that, and again, they meant it in a derogatory way, I think. And Apoorva, at the Times or other people, not to pick on her, anybody, everyone has their own lens, their own frame. The person who wrote that article for the Times, who wasn't Apoorva, the one who wrote the thing on the camp guidelines, she had her own lens through which she decided to write this. She chose not to actually look at the guidance and question the wisdom behind it. She chose to write an article simply broadcasting what the guidance is. That is not neutral either. There's no such thing as neutrality. So that whole notion, I think, is really immature way to think about this, and incorrect.
So is it the case that the problem is that there's the problem with journalism is that that journalism is certainly at this elite group of places that sets the kind of mark for everyone, that it's an ideological monolith, and that's the problem, that we're not getting enough journalism from different value systems. Like your value system is, you see the kids not going back to school, and you're like, what the heck? And then you start writing from that space. You're looking to say, hey, is this really right? And then you start looking for skeptical voices that are, that make sense, and you start looking for it. So in some senses, you're playing the confirmation bias game too. But is it the problem that there, I don't even know is it a political ideology that politically everyone belongs to one monolith, and that's the problem? I don't see, like, why is it that journalism is so monolithic then, and from a value standpoint, that they would kind of allow themselves to kind of find confirmation bias in the hypochondriac epidemiologists?
I mean, I think there are a couple things at play. One of them is an actual sort of like political leaning, which is not a secret, that most of the sort of prestige media tend to be very left leaning. And incidentally, most of my politics, at least until recently, have been quite left leaning, at least in a number of areas, not all, but a number of them. So part of it is an actual like political leaning that tends to be common amongst most of the prestige media. But separate from an actual political leaning, I think, is a leaning toward, toward a sort of groupthink, toward a sort of institutionalized kind of approach to things that, so I think like part of it is actual political, and part of it is just, look, most of the people who are working at these top places went to Ivy League institutions. They all went to Brown or wherever, Yale. Maybe they got their journalism degree at Columbia. This is, and that brings about a certain type of mindset. A lot of these people are super smart, super hard workers, super, it doesn't mean you're not smart. And it doesn't mean, and by the way, there are plenty of really, really bright, really independent thinking journalists as well. These are very large, enterprises that have a whole range of people who work there. So I don't want to paint it all with one brush, but overall, there tends to be drawing from the same pool. And you have to think about, what kind of person got into Brown? Well, not everyone who goes there is the same, but you're someone who probably got straight A's in high school. You probably, worked incredibly hard while you were in college. Maybe you went to journalism school somewhere, fancy like Columbia, where again, you did that. And then you get into, and you sort of climb the ladder at these institutions. How do you do all this? Well, you do it by understanding how to operate within an apparatus, understanding how to please certain people or please what you perceive to be kind of the overarching mentality. That's how you get there. There's probably a reason why I'm not on staff somewhere. And part of it is like, I don't know, I've just never been kind of, first of all, I went to a state school. That's just never been my interest. I certainly would like to be respected by people in positions of power. I certainly would like, and sometimes I guess I am to some extent because I write for some prestigious places. So it's not that I'm indifferent to that, but it's just that's not how I got to where I am. But if that's how you became successful, was by doing what you're told, by following it, it stands to reason that that's how you'll continue to approach your job when you're there. And you both could speak to this better than I could, certainly, which is that's how I view medicine as well. I suspect most people who work in medicine, not all, but at least a majority, are people who are understood how to succeed in a scholastic environment, understood how to follow rules, memorize information, repeat that information back to the people who are in charge of you, when you're in medical school, then when you're doing your residency, it's like, then you have to pass the boards. There is information that is true. You need to memorize that information and then regurgitate it back in order to get past those boards, it doesn't mean there isn't independent thinking along the way and creativity as a physician, but there is a certain amount of, that's how you succeed, is getting, and that probably weeds out a certain type of person to an extent, not all of them. And again, it doesn't mean that, and maybe there's good reason for having this whole process, that most people who become doctors are really bright people and really hard workers. My sister is an endocrinologist. She's really smart and she's a really hard worker. That's the type of person, and she's meticulous. That's the type of person I want to see as a doctor. But I think that also tends, for all of the good that brings, that this model brings, maybe we're seeing a little bit of the downside, and maybe you both can speak to that.
I think you're right, Dave. I think you're right, and it's not so much that we should think about it as a problem of groupthink, because groupthink makes it sound like it's people have blinders and don't understand, or maybe kind of stupidity, or even left leaning. But it's power leaning. It's
power
right,
leaning.
Power leaning, right? Doing what the power structure expects you to do. And you're absolutely right. It's very prevalent in medicine and certainly in academia. So it's doing, the things that the structures. So to the extent that the left in general, because the left in its political vision, it tends to favor bigger institutions and sort of bigger government and whatnot. I mean, that's going to promote this. It's going to be self-feeding in rewarding, if you want, this mentality of being power leaning. As opposed to, trying to be more decentralized and rewarding original views. And
so that's why it's really interesting to see what's happened in the media landscape, right? You see kind of the traditional power structures kind of certainly weakening. It's the New York Times. Certainly legacy journalism seems to be having some major issues. David, would you say that, given the media's performance, that's not to cheer it on per se, but that's understandable? That and maybe it's a good thing that the credibility of some of these legacy places is kind of being tarnished to allow independent voices to kind of flourish. Is what's happening in journalism in some ways good or bad?
Yeah,
actually, before you answer, Dave, sorry, yeah. This is a good question, but something related. I had asked you at the beginning, or tried to ask you what were your major contributions in the pandemic?
That's good,
because they were actually published in reasonably well-established magazines that are typically left-leaning, The Atlantic and whatnot. So give us maybe the highlights, the 4 or 5 big stories that you came up.
Yeah, I guess I have to mention the first piece that I did, which was in, the beginning of May of 2020, saying schools should open. And then I subsequently wrote a number of pieces just dealing with mitigation measures. Do they make sense? Someone would have to fact check me on this, but I believe it was in an article I wrote in June where I talked about, I don't think I used the phrase, like pandemic theater or something, I forget what's the phrase that everyone uses now. Not security theater, but like safety theater. Mm-hmm. I don't think but I did talk about theater. I made this joke at the end about like, they're cutting funding for drama programs. How ironic, because the biggest, theater program of all are all these, mitigation measures they're putting in place in the schools. So I think I may have been the first to sort of make that joke and point out that analogy. So questioning the school closures, questioning the mitigation measures. I wrote a piece in the fall of 2020 where I looked at schools that were open full time in my area, which is just north of New York City. And I wanted to find out, well, how is it that they're open full time and my kids are only in school 2 days a week? How did that happen? What are they doing differently there? Do they have some special sauce going on there that we don't? What is it? And I really dug into what was happening and, what makes those places different from ones that were right in the same county, 15 minutes away. How could it be so different that those kids were in school 5 days a week, all day, and my kids were at home on a computer staring at a screen all day for, at least 3 days a week? How did that happen? So, and then I blew open some stuff, I think, on myocarditis, which is when Anish and I became acquainted. And also wrote about hospitalization. What was interesting, 2 separate, unrelated studies, both peer-reviewed, published by the American Academy of Pediatrics, one of their journals, where they found that roughly 40% or more of the pediatric COVID hospitalizations were for incidental hospitalizations, that they were in the hospital with COVID, but not in the hospital for COVID. And then a number of months later, which is I think the last thing I've published thus far, I did a piece for The Atlantic, which was on adult hospitalizations, totally different methodology. This one was using sort of just data analysis where they were scraping a huge database and they found, lo and behold, very similar things for adults, which to me is, super suggestive and reassuring. When you have 3 different studies, totally different methodologies, and coming to similar conclusions, that's powerful.
Correct, because all the policy and the clamor was about, look, the hospitalization rates are climbing.
All about the hospitalization rates. And then, so, I mean, that's astonishing. If 40 or even 50% of when, various media sources or public health people are look at these hospitalization numbers. Let's just step back for a minute. Imagine that half of them are there for a reason other than COVID symptoms, or maybe they were there, but they were mildly symptomatic and they were merely admitted just out of precaution. Maybe someone had an underlying condition and it turns out it never progressed. They never, their blood oxygen level never went below 94%, which is the NIH criteria, the benchmark for what's considered severe COVID, nor do they ever even get supplemental oxygen, which that can be, given, just subjectively. 50%. I mean, so to me, when I wrote the piece for New York Magazine on the pediatric hospitalizations, I was like, I was awake every night for a week before it came out. I was like, everything's going to change. Everything. I was scared at how huge this article is going to be when it comes out. I couldn't believe what was going to happen. And yes, the article was the #1 article in New York for X number of days, and I got a lot of attention. But it was basically ignored by all of the sort of the institutions, media institutions that have their hand on the rudder. And I remember I was messaging with a friend of mine at the New York Times. I was like, why aren't you guys covering this? Why are you writing about it? And she said, well, I guess they just feel like we got scooped by you. I'm like, but it doesn't matter if you got scooped. Like, this needs to be out there. People need to know this, that like 40+% of these pediatric hospitalizations aren't for COVID. And there was no response. So it's just, I'm just perpetually I'm like in a perpetual state of like astonishment, which I get, which is exhausting. I guess it's good in the sense that it keeps me motivated, to stay engaged. But I am just continually can't believe what the hell is happening and like how ignorant so many people are, but it's largely not their fault. If you're a regular person, you work at your job at whatever it may be, you're not following this shit closely. You're just going to kind of glance at the news wherever you may get it. And if you're not giving this information, it's not a regular person. They're not going to start reading, like some article in some like infectious disease journal the way I am. They're not going to start parsing, looking at this data. So it's been a profound disservice that even something as basic as that. These were 2 peer-reviewed studies put out by the American Academy of Pediatrics. This, to my mind at least, was a stunning result, finding, and it was found twice in 2 different, the journal was very smart. They put them both out at the same time, but the authors knew nothing of each other's studies while they were being conducted. So it was not done, with any knowledge. It just so happened they published them at the same time. It was a stunning result, and it was ignored by most of the media. I don't understand how that can happen, other than people just don't give a shit for some reason, or there's something else at play. Really, instead of interviewing me, we really need to interview, I don't know who it would be, like a Daniel Kahneman or someone who like understands human nature and like what is at play. I don't know.
I think you have a large public health establishment that is very, 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 consensus them is very important because they need the mass of people to buy in. So they cannot have things that counter the narrative, or things that are nuanced, or, vaccines are good, everyone must get vaccinated. Wait, what about vaccine myocarditis? And what about the fact that COVID in kids may not be? No. That's going to complicate things, right? No. Everyone needs to get a vaccine. A vaccine is an unalloyed good. If you say anything counter to that, that needs to be minimized as much as possible, ignored as much as possible. And I think public health is terrified of that, of nuance. I think nuance and public health messaging, I guess, don't go together. I think it's self-defeat. I think they're not building trust. And I think now, if the CDC tomorrow says something about, I don't know, kids bathing in water or something for the summer, if they give some guidance on whatever, kids bathing, right? You and I are very likely to be like, I don't know. Who knows what they're saying and where it is it's coming from. I got to say, David, it's been beautiful to watch you try to parse some of this, because some of this is like, you have a layperson, you have a bunch of medical, one expert is saying one thing, another expert is saying one thing. How the heck does somebody make sense of that if, each side can be like, well, I have an expert that says this and I have an expert that says this, right? I think what I find unique about you is that you have a very, you try to escape the tribalism that sometimes exists here, that I think, unfortunately, some folks like Alec Berenson and stuff have kind of fallen prey to, right? Where you look, I think this idea that you have where you look to see where there isn't actual consensus. You look for the bald-faced lies, I think, and you go after those, as opposed to like trying to prove that Ivermectin, like, saved India or something like that, which is on one side of the spectrum. So,
Right.
And I heard you on Megyn Kelly the other day, and you just explained it so nicely, saying, it is just a frank lie for public health officials. I'm putting words in your mouth. I'm saying, you basically were saying this, that it is complete fiction that there's a consensus about masking in children. How do I know that? Forget about, I could go in, and you said this to Megyn Kelly, I could go into the weeds of the trial and confounders and stuff, but suffice it to say, just look across the pond in Europe. They have been doing something completely different for 19 months, and they do not have some tsunami of children that are like that dying or have some, the outbreaks definitely got worse when this thing happened, right? And so I think you've done an excellent job of having like keeping your wits about you when everyone is kind of panicking with, and running all over the place. So really, really wonderful job. I'm looking forward to, the stuff you write in the future.
Well, it's very flattering and kind of you to say. I mean, I'm not interested in just, like you said, the Ivermectin thing is a good point. Like, I'm not interested in specifically trying to find something that's going to go against, the mainstream idea, or like, right. In a way, all I'm doing is pointing out some obvious shit. Like, I don't even need to dig that hard. I mean, it's definitely a lot of work once I'm doing stuff and like looking at the data, but it always starts with something that's so obvious. The myocarditis thing, whenever I was like, well, wait a minute, hold on. How does, we know that children have a different, immune response. We know that we're seeing this data that's coming out. Here's a study from, I was able to speak with this guy, Dror Mavorach, who's the guy who wrote the study, who conducted the major study in Israel. The evidence was unequivocal that something was going on. There was a signal. I don't even need, the bar is very low. I don't even need to prove that there's a relationship, this like causal thing with myocarditis. All we need to do is acknowledge there's something here that might be happening. Let's take a step back and see, right? And then same thing with masks, sort of in a different way, where it's like, I don't have to prove that masks don't work, or that they're, only marginally effective in school. All we have to do is acknowledge that there's limited data. The data we have is mediocre at best. So this stuff is just so obvious. Like, I don't even have to do this like super deep dive, thing to find these like needles, buried in the proverbial haystacks. This is just like shit that when Ashish Jha or some of these other people, they keep insisting, there is a consensus on masks. Like all these people, it is crazy making. People keep using the term gaslighting. Like, right. I'm like, how is either they are just straight up lying, either he lied to Congress on purpose, or he's so wildly just in the bubble, in this churn of what they're all inside, that they are like not even aware of what they're saying. I mean, there is just empirical evidence happening in the real world of millions of children in Europe not wearing masks in schools. Maybe they disagree with that. That's fine if they disagree with that, but you just cannot say that there is a consensus. It's just demonstrably untrue to say this, and it is crazy making when you hear someone saying that and you're literally seeing the opposite happening at the same time. How can that be? How can these people in these positions of influence and power keep saying these things that are just empirically just divorced from reality? I don't understand what's happening. It is just crazy making stuff.
Dave, if it's not gaslighting, it's very close to it. Because I can't tell you how many times during the last, I was like, did I miss this? I must have missed the study on masks. I must have missed it. I need to call Anish and ask him, because he keeps his pulse on it. I must have missed it. Right. So anyways.
I mean, I know that, you guys and with Anish, that like within the medical community, it takes a lot of courage to do what you're doing. I don't know if you've had pushback from colleagues. Maybe part of it is that, Michelle, I don't know if you are. I know, Anish, you're in private practice. Maybe that enables you to have a little bit more freedom. If you were at, Penn or something, maybe presumably there would be different pressures on you, either explicit or implicit, to not be able to question some of the things. And you're not saying anything wild. You had this thread where you were just pointing out, well, wait a minute, if we step back and look at the numbers here, and there was just this long list of bizarre assumptions that the CDC took when they were comparing myocarditis rates from the vaccine versus from COVID. And there was just, you broke this, and it's like, why is that why is that like a renegade thing for you to do? Why is that like such
No,
like a rebellious or
it's
crazy thing? It
it's
shouldn't be. You're just, and no disrespect to you, you weren't doing anything like that required like advanced mathematics or like what. You were just like, okay, let's just run the numbers here for a minute, folks. And it's like I imagine you with like, you know, a pen and a napkin, and you're just kind of like, okay, let's look at this, let's look at this. Whoa, this is way off all these assumptions they're making. You know, so I mean, is that, why do you think you were able to do that? And you know, what is it? Have you gotten pushback from colleagues, or you don't care? Like, why? What is
yeah,
it that
yeah.
led to that for you?
Well, I think there's a lot of people want this thing to be over, and to be, for it to be over, I think they want 100% of the world, you know, kids, ferrets, dogs, everyone to be vaccinated. And anything that can be seen as something that can support someone not being vaccinated is seen as not being on message, and you're wasting our time, right? You're not only wasting your time, you are hampering the effort to end the pandemic. You want to end the pandemic, you want to end the pandemic, you support small businesses. You know, this is what people tell me. You support opening the economy. You know what the best thing for opening the economy is? Get 100% of people vaccinated. That includes kids, you know, from whatever ages. And the vaccines are incredibly safe. They're way safer than the aspirin that you give out. And so why are you nitpicking this stuff? So I think they, you know, so what's happening is they're starting from a conclusion of we must, like in the case of myocarditis, in the case of vaccines, we must have everyone vaccinated. Do not F up the message. Do not confuse people by bringing up this, and this, right? So I think I think that's and I think they know it. Everyone knows it, knows the signal. I mean,
Here's the
everyone,
thing I would say on
yeah,
that I think
yeah,
that I think there's an irony here, and a tragic one, in that by not being more nuanced, by not being more honest
yeah,
about it, you end up, and I've written about this in a few of my articles,
yeah,
they end up actually feeding the trolls. You end up
yeah,
feeding the skeptics. That if you actually came up front and said, hey, the vaccines are great, they're doing all this stuff, but they do have some drawbacks too.
right,
Here's what they are. You know, and we know that X number of kids are going to get myocarditis. We know blah, 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 blah. If you actually say that stuff up front, then there's nothing for conspiracy theorists to like point to. But
right,
when you pretend that there aren't any flaws, when you pretend, or you kind of like, you know, smooth over the edges
yeah,
that you shouldn't be smoothing over, then of course there's a lot of people out there who are highly motivated for a variety of reasons to pick apart this stuff. And they're going to say, hey, wait a minute. All you have to do is look at these numbers, you know, and this
right,
and the other thing, and we can find it out. It's so easy. It's so easy to just
yeah,
pick this stuff apart when they're not honest. So that's just that's the tragic irony of the whole thing, is that in trying to sort of expedite the end to the pandemic, in trying to get as many people vaccinated as possible, that the way to do that, I think, is by being super honest, and then people
right,
trust you, and then they recognize that this isn't a black or white thing necessarily. And then they'll be more apt, I think, to move forward because they believe it. But instead, by BSing everybody, then there's going to be a portion of the
right.
population who call bullshit on you. And they're
Absolutely.
not going to believe anything you say. So it's a
Yeah,
shame that they end up ruining it.
yeah,
You can't be afraid of just saying. And the thing is, we're talking about America. It does seem like, to at least varying degrees, that this problem is not as pronounced elsewhere as it is here.
right.
And I guess there's just a uniquely American lunacy at play that we don't see, at least to the extent, in most other places that we're
Well,
seeing.
I don't know. Maybe you should go to Australia and.
Oh yeah, except for Australia. Yeah.
Well, you
That's
know,
a different type of
the
situation.
other, I'm totally with you, and I think that's. I mean, I think they disagree. They disagree. They think that nope. If you people all shut up, we would have, you know, we would be a lot further along. You know, and I think their mistake, and the other mistake they make is, you know, it's like all or none. Like, okay, you have these vaccines that are tremendously effective at preventing severe illness, and the risk-benefit ratio is like massively positive for getting vaccines in adults. You know, it seems like certainly adults with comorbidities, my goodness, like, you know, there's very little else you can do, which is why I got vaccines to in the clinic, which is why we went out and gave vaccines. And was walking around in Chinatown with backpacks giving out vaccines. So it's like, no, I guess, trust me, I'm pro-vaccine. But when I think the other mistake that public health seems to make is that why do they equate everything as like, you must do all this stuff and like the efficacy, in order to end the pandemic? And so why in the heavens would you take masks, which, I mean, at most, I mean, you've probably poured through more mask data than anyone, than most people. That that mask at most are like marginally, effective probably. Maybe they're not even effective, like at kind of stopping pandemics. Why would you try to conflate vaccines and masks, right? I mean, that seems to be a
It's
big,
harmful. Yeah.
big cell phone.
Because then you have people, presumably, I mean, I don't know this to be the case, but right, then you have people, it certainly is not a good thing to have people perceiving a degree of benefit that doesn't exist. If they think the mask is doing X, but the mask really is only doing X minus 80%. That's a problematic, scenario to be in. So this idea about the effectiveness and why they can't be honest. This is like this is the big question, right? And there almost is a religious, undertone to the whole thing at this stage. And I think I may have said this on the Megyn Kelly thing. And it's like, here's the main thing that I am interested in, which is not about debating whether they work or don't work or to what extent, and I focus on schools in particular. So it's, with that area, that's the wrong debate. That's the wrong frame. The thing that we're most interested in, or what we should be interested in, is to what end? Even if they are beneficial marginally, so what? Kids are at extraordinarily low risk. Everyone else has been vaccinated who chose to be vaccinated, so they're at least largely protected. So that's it. We're asking the wrong question.
Right. You're absolutely right. And that was true in medicine even before COVID in many, many ways. This whole framing as this works or this doesn't work. So you have big debates about evidence-based medicine, and we show that, statins work or statins don't work, or framing it that way is completely wrong. The real question is it wise to use masks in this particular context? Is it wise to prescribe a statin to this person at this point in time? But when you frame it that way, then you realize that you cannot have a top-down decision that will cover the whole, right? You have to let, smaller and smaller communities trying to decide if it's the wise to mask kids in school or wise not to mask them, or wise to vaccinate or wise not to vaccinate. And that means decentralizing, that means, disempowering the existing institutions and structures.
The religious part you said in terms of is so important, because, all religions cannot brook non-believers, right? And so that's what you've seen happen really in academia. So in academic medicine, my goodness, if you are saying things that are against the grain, you are censored, you're brought in front of your department chair. I mean, it's really, really awful stuff. And, your livelihood is threatened. And it's really been pretty, painful to watch colleagues kind of go through that. It's really upsetting to see.
Which is the exact opposite of how science should function, of course.
Right.
There should be robust debate. It should be encouraged. And if you are actually confident in your position, you should welcome debate. You should welcome dissent, because then you can easily defend your position. It's only someone who is insecure in their position who is afraid of debate.
Right. So, well, they made it religious. So they made it that.
And here's why I know someone like, and I'm not saying I necessarily agree with every position of the Great Barrington, Declaration stuff, but here's like, when I first met Martin Kulldorff, one of the first things he said to me was, ask me the hardest questions you can, push back on everything. And at that moment, I knew that I'm like, this is a guy who is principled. And again, someone may disagree with him, which is fine. It doesn't mean he's right, but it means he's willing to engage intellectually with anyone and to discuss what his positions are. It's very rare, I think, sadly, to find that type of mentality.
Yeah, yeah. No,
So,
it's not that science shouldn't have believers, because but it's that if when it turns into a kind of a cult, maybe it is when you start to banish anyone that isn't isn't a cult member, right? So anyone that
right.
doesn't believe the things that you believe in, I think, and I'm really worried about that kind of progression. And but again, I think we'll wrap up here. But I think that's why what you're doing is so important, David. You're a very well-established, credentialed guy who's been writing for a long time, and it's like I said, been great. A lot of us in the medical community, take heart from the stuff that you're writing. And my goodness, just doing the elementary good stuff about, like, you said you're not like calling up some random person in some tiny developing country who's, head of the one person infectious disease department, be like, what are your thoughts on the masking community said? You're calling up, you're calling up like reasonable, good people, getting information from them. If they're anonymous, you're keeping them anonymous. If they're named, you're naming them, and you're kind of doing the legwork that folks like us in the medical community kind of always associated with journalism. So kudos to you. You're giving us like it's a wind in our sails in terms of seeing folks like you and what you're writing. So thanks again for what you're doing. I'm looking forward to, you have some books coming out. Do you
Well,
want to
yes,
tell
it's
us about the
kind of
books
you
that
to
are coming
say.
out?
Yeah. So the good news and the bad news is, so I'm writing a book about American schools during the pandemic, and it's essentially an anatomy
They were
of
closed.
the decision making. Right, school closure. It's an anatomy of the decision making process. How did this happen? So the bad news about that is I'm trying to pull back from writing so many articles because I can't do both at the same time. I the last like 5 articles I've written in my head, I'm like, this is the last one for a long time, but then I'm pulled into doing another. But I'm trying to step back a little bit. So it may be a little while until I publish something else, unless I get really pissed off. Whenever there's something that really makes me angry, I'm like, that's it. I've got to write about this. This is so important. But hopefully that won't happen. And and I'm just trying to like crank. I mean, the thing about, I'll end on this note. The thing about a book, is that articles are really, kind of like in the midst. Hopefully they're, to some extent at least, influencing some of the narrative, or at least informing people who maybe they otherwise wouldn't be informed about something. Whereas, and it's sort of in real time. Whereas a book is a very different medium, and it's something that is going to be much more of, obviously, a retrospective look at things, that it's not going to influence the pandemic. The pandemic will be over when the book comes out in a year plus from now, presumably. I know, let's hope, and I'm saying that with my fingers crossed. But even if it's over, I think there's a different type of value, right, in a sort of historical lens on things, and hopefully there's relevance to not necessarily another pandemic. There's certainly that, but beyond that, just sort of like how institutions and how people function and make decisions during these sort of like slow moving catastrophes. So I'm hoping there'll be some lessons in there, gleaned from it. What I don't want to do is write a book where it's just filled with anecdotes about kids suffering, in remote learning. Like that's not of interest to me. This sort of just, we're going to follow like 3 kids during the pandemic and see how horrible it was for them. I mean, I'm going to have some of that where we're going to like hear stories, but that's less interesting to me than the actual sort of mechanics of what has taken place. Now, I know, good narrative nonfiction does tend to focus on people and less on the sort of mechanics and machinery, but I find the latter to be much more interesting in the circumstance and hopefully more enlightening. We already are aware of these other things. So hopefully I can kind of put it together where just seeing how the wheels and the gears turn and fit with each other, hopefully I can sort of put that together in a way that's going to be enlightening and infuriating, but in a good way.
We look forward to
to see
it.
it. All right. Thanks so much, David.
Wonderful, Dave. Thank you.
It was great, and I'm so flattered to be with you guys, and very much am inspired by your own courage, and not to have a mutual affection society here, but I am very encouraged and inspired by what you guys are doing, and your own, and the own obstacles you face, within as physicians. So keep up what you're doing as well.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Take care.